All right, my young friends, we are going to do our very last in a series of 3 ecology unit review podcasts in hopes of kind of gelling out all the stuff that you hopefully looked at over the summer or just recently, whenever that might have been. Okay, so if you have any questions about any of this ecology stuff, please let me know. I'm assuming that a lot of this is review for you from years past, and if I'm assuming wrong, then I need to know that, and I need to talk with you about what you're confused about, so we can straighten it all out. Review sessions are great, but if you can't make it to a review session, then come check with me, and I will meet with you one-on-one or a small group or whatever. All right, here we go. Unit review. You need to know the definition of a population, that we were talking about all members of the same species when we're talking about a population living in a area to, nearby area to each other. Because they're all members of the same species, they're going to be relying on the same things. They need the same things. They'll be relying on the same food resources. They'll be relying on the same type of nesting site, things like that. Males will be competing for mates. There's a lot of competition because all of these organisms all have the same needs. Okay, population biologists, when they study a population, are often interested in are the numbers of that population going up? Are they going down? Are females getting more numerous? Are males getting more numerous? Is one part of the population in decline? Is a particular age group in decline or an accelerated time of growth? So most population studies are studies that are indeed done over time to determine a trend for the population. We need to make sure we've already talked about these terms, biotic and abiotic factors. Okay, we need to make sure you understand that non-living things, like all these things, and living things have effects on a population, on its size. And we will come back to this in just a minute. Let me go forward now. Make sure you understand population range. Where can the population be? How far do they range? For example, if I were looking at Carolina chickadees, perhaps their range is just, in this area, and they don't go much north of that line because black-capped chickadees are up here. Pattern of spacing, this is referring to how densely packed often the population is. Is it pretty much distance between individuals, lots of space, or is the population just packed, so there's individuals all very near to each other? And that's going to really determine, if we go back to that slide, how different factors affect the population. Abiotic factor, anything that can limit population growth. For example, if there's not enough sunlight, if you're a plant, if it's too hot or too cold, if there's not enough water, whatever. Any of those things, if they're not just right, can limit population size, and thus they are called limiting factors. Okay? Now, some limiting factors get worse the more dense your population gets. And those limiting factors are usually biotic ones. For example, if you are in a really dense population and you're all lions, then you're all competing for these zebras, and if the more lions there are, the fewer zebras there are to go around. So in that sense, this prey item really becomes a limiting factor. There's just not enough food to go around, and so the population of lions is just going to stop growing at some point because there's no food to support them. So competition for resources is a big, what we call a density dependent, okay? Meaning it matters. This is going to be made worse and ever more serious limiting factor, the more critters, more lions that are in this area. Food is going to become increasingly critical, and the population of lions will level off. Okay. That depends on how dense the population is. If the population is very sparse, then this is not going to be so severe. Abiotic factors are generally referred to as being density independent limiting factors, meaning I don't care if your population is super dense and I don't care if it is just a few. If the tornado comes through this area, if the tornado comes through this swath right there, they're all going to die. If the tornado comes through this swath right here, they're all going to die. I don't care if you've got just 3 or 4 or 104. It doesn't matter how many they are. It's equally damaging whether the population size is big or small, whereas food is much more damaging as a limiting factor to this group than it is to that group. Okay? There's just not as much competition for it over here. So density independent limiting factors tend to be abiotic, usually things like weather events, fires, drought, where there's just no water at all. There's a point where water can actually be considered a density dependent, because you're going to compete for that water. But if there's absolutely no water because of severe drought, then that's becomes it's going to kill everybody. All right, we'll move on from here. And just understand these are different ways that animals and plants disperse themselves. So population spacing, it can be clumped like a pack of dogs, or very uniform. These penguins are pretty rigid in the space they set between themselves in this nesting site, or kind of random like trees in a wooded area. All right, changes to population size. Notice that says changes to population size. Knowing the size of a population, boom, I go outside, I know how many oak trees are in my neighborhood. That doesn't really tell me anything. What tells me something is if I go outside and I find out how many oak trees are in my neighborhood today, and then I wait, and maybe next year I come back and measure them again. And so now I know, has my number changed over time, or has it stayed the same over time? Then I can kind of get a handle on a trend for my population size. So what determines population change over time? How many critters are born into your population, referred to as natality. Think prenatal unit in the hospital for babies or expectant mothers. The death rate, how many die over the year, that's mortality, mort, death. Immigration is how many actually travel into or enter the population. Emigration, how many might leave or migrate away, emigrate, exit the population. So those are all things, and how many of each of these happens over the course of a year will give you a sense of, is your population going up, is your population going down, are more dying than being born, or more leaving than are coming in, etc. Okay. Population growth rates can be affected by a lot of things. For example, how many males to females. If you only have a very few females, that's generally going to limit your population growth, because males can mate with many females, but generally a female is only going to mate once or maybe twice, so they're critical, and raise the children. How long does it take for the females to reproduce? At what age can they reproduce? Are they ready very quickly after birth? Do you have to wait a year or 18 years, or how long do you have to wait? And so one type of analysis that looks at both of these things, males to females and generations and things like that, is an age structure diagram, and we'll look at that coming up next. Also, things you'd want to look look at in determining population, things that are affecting your population size. How many reproductive cycles can a female have? How many litters? If you're a rat, you can probably have several litters in a season, whereas if you're an elephant, you're only going to have one baby every couple of years, so that's going to really impact population size. Okay. This is an age structure diagram. You need to be able to recognize this and use it. It's not very difficult, but I've seen them show up on tests. What they're showing you is, generally speaking, this is the across the x-axis, 0% of population, and moving on out this way, okay, this way. And this is the age of the people in the population. Okay, and this is indicating basically how many individuals are in each age range and how many of them are male or female. Now, what you see here is that the age of older people, there's not very many of them. The numbers, rather, of older people, there's not very many of them, but there is a whole lot of very young people who are going to be coming into this pink area, which is indicating reproductive age right here. And then when all of these people get up into here and have babies, then this bottom is going to get even wider. So this is showing a population undergoing rapid growth. This is showing pretty stable to slow growth, where your base is pretty much as wide as your top. The base is a little bit wider, but this right here, this swollen area and right here, is representing the baby boom generation, where they're after World War II, and the increase in population size. Italy, it says over here, has a zero growth population. Notice that the base is seems to be really getting narrower and narrower as you go, so that population is probably slightly in decline, or certainly not growing. So if your base is wide, you're growing. If your base is narrow, the young people the number of young people is narrow. That means your population is in decline, because they're not, as this gets smaller, obviously there's not going to be as many people coming later to have babies and boost up your population size. All right. All right, these are two really important terms that you need to know: K-selected and R-selected. And these are simply exactly what it says up here: life reproductive strategies. And it doesn't mean that every group fits neatly into one of these, but it is a general rule of thumb. K-selected species are going to be species that reproduce very, very slowly. They have to gain maturity before they have offspring. They don't have very many. They invest a lot of parental care. You need to think human. You need to think, chimpanzee, elephants, things like that. They are generally, the strategy is that I'm not going to have very many babies, but I'm going to take really good care of the one that I have, and it's going to have a much better chance of surviving to adulthood. Okay? R selected. That I try to think of that as meaning rapid. This is, think mosquitoes. All right, so mosquitoes. Okay. They reproduce almost right away from the time that they become adults. They have as many offspring as they can. They don't take care of any of them, and they just hope that some of them survive. And so they're going to blast the environment with a ton of offspring and hope that they survive, and their life cycle is quick so that they can do it all again in the next generation very rapidly. These are really opportunistic organisms that have to reproduce at the drop of a hat whenever the conditions are right, kind of situation, whereas these organisms are going to be kind of into life for the long haul, so to speak. All right, and just keep in mind that that strategy that I just mentioned. The K strategy is having lots of babies. I'm sorry, is having just a few but taking really good care of them, whereas the R strategy is having tons of babies and just hoping some of them make it, because you're not going to take care of them. Okay, and trade-offs. This is talking to that issue of, who's going to survive, the offspring or the parent, and what's the strategy involved in that. If you get the K and the R comparison, that's good enough. All right, life strategies and survivorship curves. All right, you need to know this diagram without a doubt. What this is talking about is basically the number of organisms there are, and this is what percent of their maximum lifespan they're achieving. So, in other words, this is very young over here, and this is getting old over there, and this is the survival. Okay, so let's look at an oyster. Okay. When oysters have young, they have just a gazillion larvae, and they shoot them all out into the water, and the eggs and the sperm and the larvae are created, and they're everywhere, and there's zillions of them, and almost all of them get eaten. So you start out with a lot of offspring, but very rapidly, boy, almost all of them die right away. But if they make it to adulthood and get to become a real heavy-duty oyster, protected in that shell and all that, well, then your chances of survival are really pretty good. So this is a type 3 survivorship curve, meaning that you are likely to die when you're young, but if you make it past being very young, then you're probably going to live a long time. The opposite of that would be a type 1 curve, and that's like us, type 1 curve, where we have babies and most all of them survive, and we survive really, really well until we start to get old, and that's when we die. Alright, so generally speaking, we survive pretty well and die after a long time. And type 2 survivorship curves are for things that pretty much have prey items stamped on their forehead, like a squirrel or a bunny. It is pretty much just as likely to be killed when it's young as it is when it's old. Okay, your destiny in life is to get eaten, and it doesn't really matter how young or old you are. You're just as likely to get eaten at any point in time during that lifespan. Okay, now, Generally speaking, these are R-selected species, though you could argue that there's some argument about that. But generally speaking, a mosquito would probably fit in here. It's a little debatable, but this is certainly a K-selected species right here, where you're going to pretty much survive as young and then die when you're in old age. Okay? Exponential growth is growth that starts out very slow, but then you get this enormous J curve and it goes up. Okay? What these are showing is the growth of an endangered species population when interventions are made and to save that population, and how they begin to rebound. But you see the numbers are still pathetically low here, and here as well for these, so they're certainly not out of the woods at all. We'd already talked about these, so I'll just quickly, limiting factors. We talked about biotic versus abiotic. Density-dependent limiting factors are those things that affect your population more the more of you there are. Okay, competition for food, for mates, for nesting sites, things like that. That's a density-dependent limiting factor. So these guys are clearly very densely dispersed, and so they're going to have a lot of issues with those kinds of limiting factors. Here we have one tiny little pool of water, and we got all these critters, so they're going to be competing very heavily for access to that water. So that's a density-dependent limiting factor. If more of these critters come into this area, then that's going to be harder and harder to get to that water. Density independent is just, again, a serious weather incident, or any of these abiotic factors. If the fire comes in, it's going to wipe out the whole population. I don't care if you've got a ton of them over here or only one or two of them, the fire is going to kill them all, okay? The tidal wave is going to kill them all, okay? Logistic growth versus exponential growth. We need to talk about that. Going back to that idea of the J-curve, okay? This is showing exponential growth of a population, meaning you start out with just a couple of organisms that can reproduce, and zoom, that population takes off after a while. It's slow going in the beginning, but once you get enough organisms, you hit a critical number, then you start you start with one bacterium, then you go to 2, then you go to 4, then you go to 8, and we're still pretty slow, but then 8 becomes 16, and then, whoa, 16 is becoming 32, and 32 is 64, and 64 is, I can't do math that high, and the next thing you know, boy, you're sailing through the roof here, okay? But can a population keep that up? Can you just keep growing, infinitely? Can you keep going up forever? Well, of course not. And that's why we talk about limiting factors, because there is not an infinite amount of resources in a population. Okay, so when those limiting factors start to become have an effect on the population's survival, then we see the population generally kind of level off, and that place where it levels off is called K, or carrying capacity. Okay, and what that means is the population has reached the maximum amount of individuals. Notice this is population size, number of individuals. It has reached the maximum amount that this environment can sustain over a period of time. It just can't handle any more than that. There's not enough space, there's not enough food, whatever. Okay, so this is the effect of natural controls on the population, and if we violate that, for example, in our aquatic pond, if we add nitrogen to it, that's a limiting factor. But if we add it in, then my gosh, we're going to go beyond the natural controls, because humans are adding in that nutrient, and then we run the risk of eutrophication and such. Okay, so carrying capacity. All right. Just real quick, you should understand about invasive species. These can become a population that's out of control because they have no natural predators. They've been brought in from somewhere else and they don't belong here. The zebra mussel is a great example of one. You can see that it started out up in the northern states and has been spreading ever since, because they really have no natural predators and they're very much a pest in our country. This is another one, Phragmites. Again, this is a marshy type grass that's not supposed to be here. It's quite invasive and it takes over the natural marsh grasses, and it's not a good food source. It's just not good for much of anything, and it's not good for our populations of animals that depend on our natural salt marsh cordgrass. Northern snakehead, you might have heard kudzu. I know you've seen that, an invasive species, population gone out of control. Okay, and they're not good because of these reasons. They reduce biodiversity. Number one, they kind of just take over everything. Not useful to the animals or other organisms in the area, and so on. Okay, we need to know about population cycles, predator-prey cycles. Okay, as the population of snowshoe hares goes up, okay, what we see is the population of their predator, the lynx, in the red, goes up kind of at the same time. So they oscillate together. Well, why does the hare go down? Population size go down? Well, because as the lynx go up, suddenly there's too many lynx, and so the population of hares begins to crash, and of course when the population of hares crashes, the population of lynx follows, and so on. So once the population of lynx falls down, then the hares begin to rebound until the lynx rebound too, and then they eat too many hares and back down again. And so populations of predator and prey tend to oscillate up and down like this, and they hover right around carrying capacity. Okay? They hover right around carrying capacity. You can see that the carrying capacity for snowshoe hares is just a little bit higher than the carrying capacity of the lynx. Okay? All right, human population growth is absolutely exponential, and you can't grow infinitely at an infinite rate, exponential rate forever. Eventually, it's going to need to slow down. I hope I'm not here to see any limiting factors kick in, but you can see that for a long time, human population very slow, very slow, very slow, very slow, very slow growth, and then something happens, boom, and kicks it up. What factors have contributed to that? Certainly, advent of agriculture, so that we have reliable food sources all the time, medicines, things like that. So, what does this mean for our world? Some say it means great things. Some people say it means terrifying things. We do need to be careful about how many resources we use. We certainly can't use all of our resources like we use our resources in this country. If you'll notice that the amount of land required to support an individual at standard of living of the population, to support us at our current standard of living, it takes 30 acres of land to support one United States citizen. We have the largest ecological footprint of anyone. And if everybody wanted to live to our high standard, there wouldn't be enough resources to go around. So either we're going to have to calm down what we think is a good standard of living, or we're going to have to find some more resources somewhere, and I don't know where that's going to be. So there are ways to measure population density, and I hope we'll get to try one of those out just so you can see how it works. But ways to measure organisms, for example, it's really hard to count them as they fly overhead, but if you can catch a sample, mark the sample, like with a bird band, and then release it, and then come back a later time, catch, and then see if you are catching any individuals again. This is called the mark and recapture method, and we'll learn about this later on, but it's a good way to determine how many individuals are in a population without having to count every single one of them. So we'll talk about that later. All right. Thanks for watching, and I know it's long, but it's the last one. So have a great night, or day, or whenever it is you're watching this. See you soon. Bye.